Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Entomological Society of America's Insect Photography webinar. This afternoon, we're going to take about an hour to talk about our favorite tips and tricks for insect photography. And after the first hour, we're going to have about a half an hour of general discussion for your participant questions. So how that works is if you have a question or something occurs to you, or you want to share an amusing photography anecdote you'd like us to talk about, put your question in the Q&A section and we'll keep track of that and work through them at the end. For now, anyway, there's a number of presenters that we have lined up this afternoon, and I'm not going to introduce them right now. We'll just say that all of us are on the Entomological Society calendar committee. So as you might know, the Society puts out every year an astounding insect photography calendar. I have one on my wall behind my desk. And the people who will be talking to you today are some of the members of the judging committee, and all are very dedicated and enthusiastic insect photographers. With that, let's just get started. Remember to put your questions in Q&A, and our first speaker is Megan Ash. Megan, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alex. So today I'm going to be talking with y'all about photographing iconic insect behaviors. So I don't know about you guys, maybe you're an advanced insect photographer, maybe you're just getting started. But I got into insect photography because I was fascinated with insect behavior, insect lifestyles. And the more I started working with them, the more impressed I was. And it completely inspired me to even switch my careers to become a full-time entomologist. And as an insect photographer, you know that it is an action-packed subject. Insects, they're constantly doing something. They're building a nest, they're foraging for food, they're fighting, they're mating, they're laying eggs. And when you photograph insects, you have an opportunity to not just show your technical skill as a photographer, getting those really nice crisp shots, but you also have an opportunity to really tell a story. And so you're going to learn a lot of really great technical skills during this photo webinar, but I just want to start this off as a reminder that good photos show technical skills, but great photos tell a story, and your subject matter matters. And you'll get way more engagement with your images and your social media if you post insect behaviors as opposed to just posting a stagnant insect photo where the animal really isn't doing anything. So let's start with probably the most common subject that people photograph, and that is the honeybee. So I don't know about you, but when I started taking photos of insects, I took a lot of honeybee shots because honeybees are really common. In any urban environment, as long as there's blooming flowers, you're going to run into honeybees. But because they're such a common subject, you see them a lot online, to a point where, even if you're the kind of person who's following all the photography accounts, you see so many honeybee photos, you're asking yourself, why do I even care about this anymore? I'm really, really familiar with this animal. But because the animal is so common, you have so many opportunities to photograph it. You also have a lot of opportunities to really showcase some really awesome animal behavior. So here on the left-hand side, we have a photograph of a honeybee just sitting on a rope, not really doing anything, just being a honeybee. They're cute and they're fuzzy and people like them, but it's not really doing anything. On the right-hand side, we have a photograph of honeybees performing trophallaxis. So if you're not an insect nerd and you don't know what it is, trophallaxis is when two insects exchange liquid from one mouth part to the other. It is very common behavior amongst social insects, but it's not something that a lot of entomologists necessarily have seen in person. They probably read about in textbooks, and the general public probably isn't super familiar with. So something like this really gives you an opportunity to show and teach your audience something really cool about insects through photography. And when you look at the two photos, you can just see how much more engaging it is to see a recognizable or a insect behavior that really you can talk to people about, as well as just showing somebody image. And it allows you to really make common insects fun. So it's like, Alex, I'm having a hard time advancing my slides. There we go. All right. So going back to, there we go. All right, so just a reminder. So I don't know how you guys are displaying your photographs, how you're sharing them with the world. You could have a website, you could have Facebook, you could have Twitter, Instagram. There's a lot of different options there, but no matter how it is that you engage with the public and you share your artwork, what I can tell you is that when you photograph insect behaviors, you're going to get a lot more engagement. You're going to get a lot more people following, liking, reposting the work that you do. And it's kind of an easy way to cut through a lot of the noise. So there's a lot of wildlife photographers out there, but when you photograph insect behaviors, you really stand out. So here on the right-hand side, I have a post from Twitter. It's a very, very common pollinating insects. However, because I was showing a behavior and just providing a little bit of additional educational information, it became a very popular post. So really just adding that a little bit of additional like engagement, allowing people to relate with their subject a little bit more through behavior really helps to give your images some traction. So here is another example. So this works for videos as well. So this was a video that I took of a European wool carder bee just grooming itself. That's it. That's all it was. And it ended up being seen by over 66,000 people. And that's because people love seeing behaviors. And so preparing for this presentation, I put a survey up on Twitter just asking people, why do they love insect photography and videos? And gave them the options of saying, hey, is it because you really like to discover new species that you've never seen before? Or is it because you like seeing behaviors? You like seeing insects doing something? And the behavior option got almost 3 times the responses. So I think it's kind of heartening to know that, like, even if you do not have the availability of traveling someplace exotic, like going to a jungle and finding a bunch of cool insects that most people haven't seen before, you can still generate really sophisticated and interesting media, photographs, videos, whatever, that people are going to be really interested in, even just photographing things in your backyard. So just going to give you some ideas to noodle over. Here's some things you could be photographing right now of insects. So pollination, obviously probably the most common behavior photograph, but thinking about things like oviposition or egg laying, fighting for things like resources in the environment, lots of bees and wasps that are solitary, dig tunnels. That's a really cool subject and able to capture. Mating behavior, nest defense, hunting, grooming. These are all really great subjects that if you can capture this as opposed to a photograph of an insect sitting like on a leaf or something, you're really going to pull in your audience and make them more interested in what's going on with your image. And the bonus is that when you photograph insect behaviors, you're giving your images some great scientific value as well. So if you're an entomologist, and I'm sure a lot of you are on this call because this is being hosted by the Entomological Society of America, what you'll find is that if you have the skills to take technical photos plus research skills, you make friends very, very quickly in a department. It's a really cool thing to put on your CV. It's a really cool way to engage with your coworkers, because even though you may think that the photographs that you take of, say, like your research system, say you're like studying aphids, you're like, oh, I'm sure there's like a million aphid photos. Nobody cares about my aphid photos. The reality is that they do, because there actually isn't as many great behavior photos of common insects in research systems than you think. And if you're taking those images and you're doing a great job in banking them, you've got a absolutely invaluable resource for you to use for yourself for things like posters and talks and textbooks and publications, but also great resources that you can share with and partner with other researchers. So with that, I'm going to say one last thing and then pass it off to the next speaker, because we've got a full docket today. And that is, those of you guys that are really deep into macro photography, you know that when you take photographs with a macro lens, your depth of focus is really, really shallow. And that means that if you're out in the field photographing insects, sometimes you have to choose where your focal point is going to be. You cannot necessarily photograph an entire insect at once if you're just getting one shot. And if you have to choose what part of the body is going to be in focus on your subject, try to get the head and the eyes in focus. People love looking at faces. It doesn't matter if it's an insect or if it's a person. People love faces. And even though insects don't have facial expressions, people will project facial expressions and personality onto an insect if the face is in focus. It like just very quickly makes your photograph so much more fun to interact with. And though I'm sure there might be some physiologists or some taxonomists here on this call that are like, Megan, that's not the best part. The best part is the butt. The best part is the leg. It's the thing I study. If you're trying to appeal to a general audience, getting the face and the eyes in focus is incredibly important. So I'm going to pass this on to the next speaker.
Good. All right. Hey, everyone. So glad to have all 390 of you here with us today. So we're going to move on to some other topics. My name is Isa Betancourt, and two topics that I find particularly exciting with insect photography is the different angles you can shoot them at, and then also managing the approach of your subjects. So, all right. So going off of what Megan said, it's definitely really helpful to get an engaging shot through capturing the eye in focus. And the cool thing about bugs is that they have really big eyes. So you can oftentimes get the insect's eyes in focus from many different perspectives. So for example, here, I was walking in the New Jersey Pine Barrens and encountered a grasshopper on the trail. So I took my camera, pointed it down, and voila, I took this shot with the eye in focus. Now the question is this the most engaging shot? What if I drop down to eye level with my subject? So, one sec. Okay, so here's a photo of me where I'm fully horizontal, belly on the ground, and so that's how I took the following shot. Okay, next slide. So, here I am at eye level with my subject, and there's a whole new perspective that I did not get from overhead. I unlocked a whole new view and depth of its surroundings and what it is seeing right there on the ground. Now, not only can we see its eyes, but we can see its face, its mouth, its legs. It's also interesting to see behind it, there's some pine needles or some sticks that kind of pair in an interesting way with the way the antenna are. Maybe it's part of its camouflage. So there's a lot more to work here with and to engage a viewer. And then you can keep on taking other photos. So this grasshopper hopped and then landed on this stick, which gave some more interesting elements to take into consideration when I was composing my shot. If you're familiar with the 1/3 rule in photography, you can see that coming into play here. If you're not familiar, I encourage you to look it up. It helps with organizing how to place your subject and the other elements in the photo on the image as you crop and figure out how you're framing your subject. So also interesting here too, you see the colors complementary with the very camouflaged subject. You know it's in its home. So, okay, next picture. Okay, so here's another photo I took in Colombia. And for this photo, the thorax and the abdomen are slightly more in focus for this syrphid flower fly that was on a plant. So this is my first shot, and then I moved around to see what other views were available. So here's a much more exciting image. I got eye level with my subject and instead of overhead, and it unlocked a whole new view that wasn't accessible before from the other image. It gave more information. You can see the behavior occurring here, like what Megan was talking about earlier, where you can see the feet on the anther. The subject is fully engaged with the anther of this flower. And you can even see little pollen granules. So it's a much more exciting shot. And we're right there up close with the subject. So to kind of hit this point home, here's a spider that I photographed as I was working outside in the backyard last summer. And it crawled onto the picnic blanket that I was on, and I got my camera, took a shot, and the eyes are in focus. However, if I played around with some other views and got eye level to it, face to face with my subject, like you do for a human portrait, for example, and got a much more captivating photo of the subject, face to face. Okay. And then here's one too, where I did take a straight on photo, but the bee itself was sideways. And so it revealed the other perspective where you can see it engaging with the flower and the pollen on its belly and legs and mouth parts too. So So now I want to relate this approach to drone photography. So here I took my drone out with my extended family back in 2019. We went peach picking, and so I had some fun taking a shot. And so here's an above photo. It's somewhat interesting. You can see the landscape, but then I also wanted a more engaging photo of my family. So I lowered the drone for another shot. And this definitely is highlighting my subjects more, highlighting my family. Although I'm not looking at the camera, I'm looking down at the drone as I'm taking the picture. But you can see more going on. It's more interesting. It's more focused on our subject. And then in comparison, here is a photo of some little katydid grasshoppers from above, and I'm basically the drone with this. When I just turn my camera down to take a picture, it's an aerial view, which sometimes it works really well, and other times it is more like of a landscape habitat result. So it really also depends on what you're going for. But if you're looking to connect your audience with your subject, like help them dive and get immersed in your subject's world, try to get that eye-to-eye level. Okay, so a couple other shots. So this one's face-to-face with your subject, a portrait of a praying mantis from my friend's backyard. And then here, there's a photo that I took of, portrait I took of a giant weevil in Colombia, and face to face. And I can like imagine a person standing in this way with their leg up on a stool or something like that. And so very different from if I took a photo from above. So make sure you get low and try different angles. Of course, oh, and here's another one. So a photo from above. This is in Center City, Philadelphia. And it went, one sec, it went back a little too fast. But anyway, you saw the one photo from above, and what it didn't reveal was on if there was pollen on the underside of the abdomen of that bee. So here you can see this photo from the side. I was able to not only bring the image to show what the bee sees, how its world looks in its environment, but then also you can even see the detail of the pollen, how it's collected on the underside of the abdomen for this megachilid leafcutter bee, rather than the typical what people often see, which is the pollen on the hind leg. So that revealed that detail, getting that other angle, and also allowed me to use the elements like the other branches from the flowers to construct a very pleasing image that draws your eye along in many different directions. Yeah, so of course, what the challenge here too is then approaching the subject, because sometimes it does involve getting very close. And how to best approach your subject definitely depends on what your subject is from one species to the next. In this case, for example, an easy one is with butterflies and oftentimes dragonflies, really any insect that might be basking in the sun. You want to be careful to not block the sun, not create an eclipse. And then the insect's like, what's going on? Or like you're changing the habitat of it, and then it will be scared. It'll see this big giant animal, the photographer, who's threatening. Sorry, my cat's tail is flicking into the screen. And I'll move her over. And then it'll fly away because it's scared and startled. So you do have to be very, very careful with your approach. And then also different insects will react differently to being approached and feeling threatened. And for example, beetles tend to drop. So my point here is that you want to give yourself some time and some space to understand and get to know the insects that you're photographing, because that will help you best to know how to work with the subject or the insect that you are looking to photograph. So with that, I will pass it on to the next speaker.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Super happy to see now we have over 400 people on today. So really, really excited to see so many people. I'm Danae Wolf, and I'm going to be talking about how to take better backgrounds in situ, how to avoid flash fall off. We'll start there. And then a couple other tips and tricks for getting good composition, avoiding distractions in your shots. I do, however, see a lot of questions coming into Q&A about what equipment each of the photographers is using. So I thought I would kind of start there just to provide a little bit of context. Like 99% of my work anymore, I use primarily a reverse lens setup, which looks something like this. Is on a Canon 5D Mark IV, and then I have a reverse mounted 40mm lens, and I have to be just like 2.5 to 3 inches away from my subject to photograph it. I'm telling you that because it'll provide a little bit of context for some of the other things I'm going to talk about here as we go through the presentation. So what is flash fall off? Why does it occur? How can we create flash fall off in situations where it makes sense or avoid it when we don't want it to happen? In macro photography, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes we are using some sort of flash system. As the light from the flash travels further away from the point source where that light is coming from, it starts to grow less concentrated, more diffuse, and just like a flashlight in the forest, it can't go on forever, right? So it's only going to be able to illuminate things for so far. I've made this awesome graphical representation for you with a four-legged insect, which I realized after choosing this awesome icon from PowerPoint. We're just going to pretend like this insect got in a fierce battle and lost 2 of its legs, but lived to see another day. So the flash output here, we're assuming that we have something like a macro ring flash attached to the end of the flash there. And we have then the background depicted by sort of this dark line on the right-hand side of the screen. The flash output, so you do the shutter, flash comes out of the camera or out of the flash. It's concentrated enough to illuminate your subject, which is close enough to be illuminated. But if the background is too far, it could be vegetation. It could be like, flowers in the background or leaves or the ground or anything. If it's too far away, then it won't be concentrated enough to be illuminated. So what you end up with is a really dark background, which can work really well with certain subjects. So for example, this is just a beautiful tree hopper. This is one of my favorite. I love membracids, and this is just a really cool tree hopper, bright green. This would have probably blended into whatever it was sitting on, and it might not have been you just wouldn't have gotten so many details. I wanted to have that flash fall off because it really helps to create this high contrast image where it sets the subject away from the environment. Now, if you were trying to produce an image where you wanted to show how well this tree hopper blends into the environment, then you wouldn't want to let the flash fall off, because then you would really see less contrast there and see how well this insect camouflages into its surroundings. Here's another example of where that works really well. This little pale green assassin bug nymph emerging from an egg case. Because I let the flash fall off, you see all of these beautiful details in the hairs along the legs and the antennae. Those details would get lost if I had some like bright colored background happening there. So I let the flash fall off. It achieves that nice darkness to set it apart. Same with this little plant hopper, because it's light in color, that flash falls off just naturally, and it really sets that subject out from the background. Now here's a situation where I should have let the flash fall off because it's a really light colored plant hopper. And instead I chose to hold a leaf behind the subject. And as a result, I kind of lost some of that detail in that plant hopper. So what I should have done is just let the flash fall off, achieve that nice dark background, and it would have really set that subject then apart from the background. So what happens when you don't want that dark background? You want to achieve some like nice color. As I've mentioned here, this situation, I just held a leaf behind the plant hopper, and I do that all the time, but there are some other things you can do too. So we just want to take that background and move it closer to the subject to ensure that the flash doesn't fall off before it hits whatever is in the background of your subject. So in this situation, it was all just about my own position in relation to the subject. I had to position myself so that I was photographing this dragonfly sort of down towards the ground. And in doing so, I was able to illuminate basically the ground and the vegetation on the ground to produce this sort of nice tan brown background. And it would have kind of been at a diagonal because you'll also see the sunlight is coming in and kind of backlighting the dragonfly a little bit, which provides some detail in the hairs on the body of the dragonfly. So something else to keep in mind is sort of your position in relation to the sun and how that sunlight or other ambient environment, light from the environment can help provide some nice like fill-in light. Alex is going to be talking more about flash and diffusion, so that'll kind of drive some of these points home too. So here's an example where I positioned myself in relation to the subject so that I had a great big leaf behind me. I didn't really have to do anything, hold anything behind the subject. It was just all about my own positioning in the environment to ensure that there was something close by, far enough away that it's out of focus. I don't want a lot of detail in that background because for me, I call myself a bug and botanical portrait photographer. I'm doing portraits. I'm not necessarily doing things that show the environmental context. So I want it to be far enough away that it isolates the subject. It's not really a distracting background, but it still provides a nice color. Otherwise, the dark of this subject would have really been lost in a dark background. Here's another example of oak tree hoppers photographed in situ. So meaning, I didn't remove these from the natural environment. I shot them where they were in the natural environment. And I found an oak leaf on the ground. It was fall in Ohio. So found an oak leaf on the ground, held it behind the subject, and I got this beautiful like gradation of color. At first glance, you might look at this and say that looks really unnatural. And it does look unnatural because number one, I couldn't have chosen like a better gradation of color. I didn't even intend for that to happen. I just chose a random oak leaf. But it's not exactly what the environment looked like, right? I kind of manipulated that by holding something in the background. And just to kind of show what that looks like is I'm photographing this. I'm holding my camera here and we're just going to pretend that this Post-it is like a leaf. And I'm just holding that directly behind there, getting it nicely into focus, far enough in the background that it doesn't have the details like the leaf veins, but it's still there providing some nice color behind the subject. Another example of a membracid, like I said, I love my membracids, with just a leaf held behind it so that I didn't get that flash fall off. Now, what happens if you don't have anything in the immediate environment? You don't have leaves, you don't have maybe something else that you can hold. If you're using sort of a setup that isn't so close, and that you don't really have an arm's length to use where you can physically hold something behind your subject, you can simply position yourself in relation to that subject so that you're photographing it up towards the sky. Assuming you are shooting in daylight, that sky is always going to provide a really, really nice source of ambient light that's bright enough to illuminate subjects. So here for this little jagged ambush bug, depending on the time of day and the weather, whether it's cloudy or not, that sort of blue or gray color might look a little bit different. Here it was a little bit bluer. Here in Ohio, though, we have a lot of gray days. So sometimes it's like more of a gray background. So here's a skipper with that sort of grayish background there. And then in this shot, you actually see some clouds starting to become obvious in the shot. So shot up towards the sky, but there's some big fluffy clouds out there. And that's where you see sort of these lighter like puff colors. And then, yeah, we can go on to the next one. This little firefly also shot. Probably, I'm guessing I shot this probably later into the evening because the sky's a little bit darker. Could have used some better diffusion here against this guy too. But again, just a really nice sort of isolated picture where you're just focused on the subject, not necessarily the broader environmental context. And then this one I remember struggling through, these little sawfly larvae eating little holes in this leaf. I just thought this was a wonderful composition, but every time I photographed it, those dark holes, I was getting that flash fall off in those dark holes, and I was losing all of the detail in those sawfly larvae. So what do? Just hold it up towards the sky, you get that nice blue color coming in, and all of a sudden you can see those sawfly larvae really nicely illuminated in a way that they weren't when I just had that flash fall off. A lot of people also use other people. If you're out in the field and you have friends, family, kids, even a backpack or a camera bag, you can toss that into your environment too and create sort of an artificial backdrop that way. I know a lot of people use like their friends and just say, hey, stand here so I can have like the color of your shirt in the background. Depending on the color of the shirt, it might look more or less natural. If it's like a natural color, it could look really cool. If it's like a tie-dye shirt, it might still look really cool, but maybe a little bit less natural. So just some creative decisions to think about there. And then the final tips that I just wanted to share about photographing your subjects in situ is maybe how to avoid some of the distractions that happen, or maybe how to include some of that context so that you do get more of the environment in your shot. So this would have been an example not shot with the reverse lens, so not really high magnification here. Further away, longer macro lens. But I've selectively focused on the one purple coneflower and the bumblebee, but I have enough focus of the background that you get the context that there are a lot of other coneflowers here in the environment. So they're out of focus, so they don't really distract you, but they're still in focus enough to understand what's going on outside of just the frame of reference here for this subject. So those are some creative decisions you can make. Now, what about a situation where you have something like resting on a leaf and maybe part of the leaf is creating a distraction or it's creating like a weird horizon line? In this photo in particular of this little scarlet banded leafhopper, candy striped leafhopper, I love that name. The flower or the leaf kind of curled up, the back end of that leaf kind of curled up and created a weird horizon line kind of midway through that leafhopper. And I didn't want that. I wanted the leafhopper to be purely isolated against that dark background. So I just sort of folded that leaf in half, got down at eye level as Isa was talking about, and photographed it on sort of this plane of focus so that I didn't have that distraction in there. I tend to fold leaves all the time. Not all subjects will allow you to do that. They won't be super cooperative, but every once in a while you'll get a nice cooperative subject that will let you do that. And here's an example, this will be the final example I share of a tiny, tiny little jumping spider on a little aster flower. One of the photos that I took, and I should have included it here, one of the petals of that flower was actually coming up and it was directly in front of the jumping spider. So you could still see the jumping spider, still had some photos with that in focus, but that petal just created a distraction that wasn't needed. A couple things that you can do. If you have a cooperative subject, just pull that petal down a little bit. Or you can simply, like I twisted the flower a little bit just to make sure that was no longer in my shot, adding that distraction. So just playing around. Sometimes you might get like stray blades of grass or stray plant stems, just kind of gently moving those out of the way. If I'm in my own yard, sometimes I might just like, pick little pieces of the petal or flowers off of the plant altogether so they're not in my way. However, if you're in something like a public garden, national park, public park, you might not want to be seeing like ripping vegetation out of the ground, to really get that perfect shot. So there might be some ethical issues there. But in my own garden, I sometimes pluck leaves off the trees and stuff just to get better positioning for some of my photos. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex, and he's going to talk about flash and diffusion.
Yeah, just get up here. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Wild. I am the curator of entomology at the University of Texas. I've been a macro photographer as kind of a combination of a hobby and a business for a couple decades now. And I shoot mostly Canon digital SLR equipment. You can email me if you have questions about the particular, or here's a good trick. If you're looking at any photo, embedded in it online often is what's called the EXIF data. And if you go to my website and click on the data for each image, it'll tell you what lens and flash and all that was used for that shot. It's a really great trick for trying to figure out like what equipment was used for that. So anyway, I'm going to talk a bit about flash, just expanding a bit on what Danae was talking about. Just as soon as I can get the presentation to work. Yes, okay. So photography is literally the recording of photons as they hit some kind of sensor. Used to be chemical film back in the day. Now it's an electronic sensor. And being in the game of recording light, the source of light is extremely important. The color, the direction, the intensity, that is pretty much everything with photography. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. I notice a lot of us talking about flash. If you see insect photographers in the field, most of us are wandering around with various flash units in our hands and on our camera. And the reason for this is because our subjects are really small. And when you get in super close to get magnification, the depth of field gets narrower and narrower until if you were to just sort of take a standard camera, point it at a bug, and use the standard rules of photographic exposure, playing with your aperture and shutter speed and whatnot, what you tend to get are these dreamy images where only the narrow sliver of the insect is in focus. This works well for some artistic compositions, but most of the time it's just too blurry for a lot of us. So, of course, what do? We point our camera to bug, and we get enough light by keeping the aperture wide open, and we keep the shutter speed going for a bit. We get this picture, but it's too fuzzy. So what we want to do is stop down. So we shrink down the aperture, take another photo, and this is intentional. It looks like this, because if you try to extend the depth of field the traditional way by stopping down that aperture, it just cuts off light in a very low light situation, and you end up with darkness. So you can counteract this. Traditionally, one way you counteract dark exposure is to compensate with your shutter speed. So just open that shutter for a long time, and then you get something that looks like this, because you've moved in the half second it took to do it, so you get blur. What's the solution to this problem? Well, flash. That's how you get these nice, crisp, focused images, is you flood the image, you flood the insect with light with your aperture stopped down, and you get this nice, crisp image. Trouble with flash is it often looks like flash. So here's the same ant. The top photo shows just a standard flash picture. As you can see from the hotspots, it's a twin flash. The bottom photo shows the same ant, but all I've done is put a diffusion layer between the flash and the subject. This is basically a piece of white tracing paper. And it makes your handy flash trick look more natural and allows more details on the insect to come out. So it's often very important to control the sort of softness of the light. Of course, one way you can get nice soft light is to just photograph at particular times of the day, cloudy days, dawn or dusk, when there's no bright hot spots. This was a picture taken of an ant with a little handheld digicam and just natural light. You can see that's natural diffusion. But again, this is a technique that is for people with a lot of patience and who can be available at very particular times. You can get a nice effect with ambient light. And I mean, it's worth playing with, but if you really need to produce images, you're often going to be using flash. So anyway, here's a picture of my flash diffuser looking at the front of the camera. So you see the front of the macro lens. And what I've done is build a 2-layer tent out of this, I think was tracing paper, but I now use this thing called Roscoe Lux Tough White Diffusion. I can tell you about it later. And I shine the flash through it, and these are two beetles, or one beetle shot two ways, one without the diffuser and one with the diffuser. And you can see that it's a lot softer there in the second image. Because diffusion is important, I pretty much put a diffuser almost anytime I use a flash. So sometimes I'll just set up a remote flash around some flowers, and then that'll allow me to freehold the camera and move around. This one's a little bit backlit. Sometimes I'll take a flash and put it in a white box. That's basically what it sounds like. It's a box that's white on the inside, so that when you set a flash off to go up, so it's reflecting off the white surfaces on the top and sides of the box, it gets this lovely cloudy day look. It's product photography for bugs. You can put leaves and things in the box too, so it looks like a natural setting, even though that beetle at the bottom, that's actually in a white box as well. All right, so I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on Danae's point with flash, because if you're used to shooting without flash, you do this little thing where you're adjusting your ISO and your shutter speed and aperture to get the exposure right. With flash, you're bringing your own light, and that kind of turns things backwards. So the process for lighting properly with flash is to figure out first what your desired camera settings are in an ideal world for depth of field and composition. And then you adjust your flash power up and down for an optimal exposure. So here's, let's say, I don't think silhouettes are used anywhere near enough in insect photography. Here's a wasp laying an egg and a grub through a tree branch. Here is no flash at all. I've just calibrated the exposure for the background, so I'd get this sort of nice natural light. That's sort of one extreme, no flash, all background, get a silhouette. Or I can bring up an intermediate amount of flash and get you still see the background there, but then you get this fill flash coming from the camera. Or you go the other extreme, as in these, with extreme flash fall off, where you just have a ton of light right on the bug and the background drops to black. Even though I took this picture in the middle of the day, it was there was filtered light in the forest behind it, but the flash was so bright, it just obliterated everything. So when I exposed for that bright flash, the background dropped away. One of the more interesting things you can do with flash is take it off the camera. And that is done a number of ways. I'm not really going to get into too much, but one of them is to get a little, you see on top of the camera here, there's this little wireless transmitter. You can put flashes on receivers, and you can put flashes in different places. And this gives you a lot more creative control over that light. Here's just an example. Here's a leafcutter ant at Bracken Ridge Field Lab walking down an elm trunk carrying leaves. And all I've done is shoot the same scene with 3 different lightings. The one at the bottom right is ambient, so it's just a normal exposure with no flash, showing sort of the light of day. The one at top right shows the flash coming from the direction of the camera and lighting the leaf and the ant from the front. And then the big picture on the left, and you can even see the flash, I've moved the flash behind the ant, and it is shining through the leaf. Everything translucent in that scene just kind of glows. So you get the little halos around the ant. I don't know, I have a preference for which one I like, but you can do a lot creatively just by putting your light source in different places. Here's just an example in the field where I set up these strobes around where carpenter bees were defending their territory. And I was able to get a nice little back kick while they hovered from an off-camera strobe. Sometimes I'll set up a little infield studio where I've got 2 strobes on a tripod around a flower, and then I'll just sit there free holding a camera so I can line myself up and just take pictures of the insects as they come and go in this little setup. This is pretty much the same setup indoors, where I've got 2 diffuse side flashes able to really kind of bring out some of the subtlety of this emerging mosquito. And this, again, the power of this shot is that I've managed to take the light off the camera for the effect. Anyway, I can talk for days about flash and light and all that, but I won't. I will pass you on to expert entomologist Tom Myers, who has been creating tremendous photos for a very long time. And Tom, let me hook you up with control here. All right. Thank you, guys.
Okay, do I have control? There we go. Okay, I'm going to talk about getting critical sharpness in the field, because as we know, when we're trying to work with these insects, here we have the eyes in focus, but the rear of the insect goes out of focus. But it's really hard sometimes to be steady enough and to have the small enough movements, the fine enough movements to go ahead and get that critical detail. And here I have a fly that's biting my arm, so I'm sliding the camera up and down my arm. And the main problem is that the contortions I have to get into to photograph. You have to apologize too, because I've got allergies bad and I cough, so I'm sorry. Let me go to the next one. Okay, Alex, where am I going? There we go. So again, trying to get focus on the eye, we've talked about that a lot, but you got a narrow plane that you're working with. In the top left, I've done some backlighting on that one with the technique Alex was talking about, using an additional flash in the back. Trying to get that sharpness here, I'm in the same plane, so the insect, getting the eyes in focus, you're kind of maneuvering yourself around there, but you need to be able to do this to get good sharpness and also get the composition that you want. Trying to move your body around and having control of your body and your camera while you're doing this. But if you're getting steady to get sharp, and that's what you have to try to work at doing. We use a lot of ground support when we're shooting, because the ground gives us stability and will go ahead and allow us to move back and forth with the subject as we're trying to get the image in focus. And we here, Alex is probably sliding the camera back and forth in his hand, as well as sliding his hand on the ground, trying to get that critical area in focus. But you're down trying to get eye to eye when you're working on the ground, trying to shoot these insects and trying to get the critical areas in focus that you want in your photograph. You're getting up close to that insect, being able to be in control of the situation, and getting the right areas in focus, get right areas in that are sharp that you need for your image. But also you can follow the action. You can move around. You can follow the action as this wasp is dragging its prey around. You can move back and forth and easily slide on the ground to follow what is happening with the subject. And trying to get the best angle, moving around, as was mentioned before, moving around to get the angle that you want to give you the most dramatic image in your camera. And working on composition. You can't do that if you're not in control and not stable. You can't really work on the shots that you need. And getting comfortable also means trying to get steady and getting sharp. And you can do that in different ways. We work on our knees a lot. And so we're down on our knees quite a bit. And I know a lot of photographers, a lot of insect photographers who use knee pads, and it really helps a lot because you're not only working in sticks and rocks and everything else, but sometimes you're shooting just in rocky areas. So trying to get that working, and also in damp areas where there may be a lot of moisture, and trying to get down low and photograph. There we go. And also a good thing to use too are waterproof or Gore-Tex pants. Help you because when you're sitting down in some of these dirty areas, swampy areas, wet areas, it helps you to sit there for a long period of time to work the subject, to get the angles you want, to get the focus you want, and to move around. And sometimes I also use some type of an elbow pad, which helps. Another technique when you're out in the field trying to get control is to brace and hold. Brace and hold against yourself, trying to get yourself stable, getting down on your knees, bracing against your body, trying to get as stable as you can in working with that insect. When you're trying to shoot, you only have a very narrow focus, 1 to 2 millimeters sometimes, depending on the magnification you have. And trying to hold that is hard. You may be trying to get a documentation of what the insect is, but trying to hold that is really hard to do for a long period of time. So, there's support out there that you can use. A lot of times in nature, you can find a tree or something. Here he's put his hand on the tree to allow his camera to go back and forth and to get that critical focus that he needs. You can extend your hand like that. Sometimes your muscles or your tendons will get still shake trying to do that, but you can also put your hand on the branch and again, move the camera back and forth above your hand and get the focus that you need. When you're doing high magnification like that, it's really very shallow depth of field. And here it's like you're smashing your knuckles because you get such a narrow depth of field. You can actually use pressure on your hand and get it in focus and relax a little bit to get that critical focus that you need. I've shot a lot of times in the rainforest. You have a lot of these trees that have big thorns on them, and trying to get close to that situation or remain stable is a problem. To trying to stick that focus to get the areas in focus you need here, the eye and along the body, getting parallel, with that object. So a lot of times I work and pick up a stick in that area, and you can slide that stick back and forth in your hand, depending on your magnification, depending on how close you need to get to your subject to go ahead and get the shot that you need, the composition you need, and get it in focus. And that works on a lot of different insects. I've shot a lot of ants sometimes, some that are trying to defend the tree, but by putting the stick there and watching that the ants don't run up the stick, then you can go ahead and get the shot that you need. And here is a larva on the tree that's I was able to get, again, parallel, get the areas I needed in focus, and to get the shot. You have a lot of gear too that you're working with, and trying to get all that stable. You can only hold so long with your back and your legs and your arms. So you have a lot of weight when shooting with macro, and sometimes you're using telephoto lenses. I like to use monopods to use sometimes because there's little disturbance. You can move it in and out close to a subject. You can lean in and out and easily adjust the height, and it holds the weight. Attach a ball head to this and also gives you more camera movement as you're trying to move around. But by being able to handle that weight, it gives you one hand that's free, that you can control the subject, control the leaf, or whatever you're working with. You can also use tripods. I a lot of times use a small tripod. It's really good in the mornings when insects are very slow on cool mornings with the dew. You can shoot with a tripod. You can use yourself as a human tripod, the more contact you have with the ground, but it also lets you shoot a series of shots. We can shoot one shot, then light it differently, and then shoot another series. It helps both with backlighting too, when you're trying to backlight or shoot long exposures in the rainforest. If you're using long glass, here I was using a 300 millimeter with a teleconverter and with a close-up tube to get this shot, and I'm in the edge of the water and trying to hold all this still and trying to get the shot is kind of hard by yourself. But getting in focus and waiting for the action, you have the action that may happen, as we were talking about before, shooting behavior. If you can sit there with your tripod and focus, you can shoot that. Sometimes you also have to control wind, and wind can be a problem as it's moving around. So you need to hold that object, hold the camera, hold the leaf together, and that way you're both moving in the same time. You're bringing here I have a support, and also I'm holding the leaf. And it helps better if you get closer to the lens, you get finer control. But you can get the fine details by holding that leaf. Sometimes, again, moving it back and forth are allowing you to get the critical focus that you need here on this wasp, where it's taking the spider back to its nest. There's also, we talked about moving things out of the way. You can use clamps, which are good. They can hold objects sometimes still, but also can use it to move other flowers or leaves or something out of the way, particularly if you're in an area where you can't cut those. Focus lights are great, getting it sharp. You have to be able to see it to be able to get it sharp. So there are different focus lights out there that you can use in trying to get it sharp. And there's also, you need something to hold everything in place. So we've gone through some different types of equipment, and here it is. Here I'm using a focus light, tripod with the knee pads, and using the plank control to get a sharp shot. But that helps you to control the leaf, the stem, and the subject, getting them parallel, going ahead and focusing on small insects, as well as getting everything parallel. So you can get, if you have two different insects in the shot, you can get everything parallel. This is on a tripod, and I'm kind of moving the stem and moving the leaf around so I can get both things parallel. But this allows you then to get everything in place. And I'm finished. Okay, next up.
Okay, next up is Chris Brown. Chris, you there?
So it's hard for me to put into exact words of how cool I think these isolated insect shots are. But the best thing I could do is it gives you a chance to really celebrate the insects without any distractions from the backgrounds, to really highlight these cool morphological features that we love about our insects, the details, the key characters. The shots are really great for presentations. The images blend really seamlessly into the background for a very custom look, really helpful for like entomology 101 type presentations, where you really want to focus on the insect and those key characters. And of course, we all really are partial and love our specific subject. So to have our subject isolated, at least for the first part of a presentation, can be really helpful. Okay. And just a quick call out, I just use a little bit more flash just to wash out that background, to really isolate the insect on the white background of the PowerPoint slide. And here you just kind of see the difference between one that is fully washed out versus a little bit grayed out. And you can go ahead And so this is just a quick kind of callback to what Isa was saying about the kind of the insect wrangling side of things. Not only do you want to get the light right, but you want to take the time to make sure you're getting a good, lively pose. And so there's lots of tricks for that maybe you could have your own presentation on that alone. The techniques is super simple. You know, at its easiest, it can just be a piece of white paper. You know, everybody's probably been in a hotel room where you found an insect and you weren't quite ready to take a picture of it in the field, and you just wanted to bring it back and at least get something like a shot on a white background. A little bit step up from that, but still simple, is setting up a white box. Alex talked about it before, so no need to go into that too deeply. But again, there are lots of opportunities online to find directions on how to make these. There's some commercial versions that I don't have myself, but I know I've seen around. And you know, I fold this up and take it on the road all the time. So you know, you can always pop it into your car and take these shots elsewhere as well. And as Alex said, we're just reflecting the light to give us a really nice even light on our subjects. And you're not limited to just a white background. You can put a substrate or leaves or sticks and that sort of thing into that system as well. And then transitioning to the other topic here. So images series that tell a story, and it doesn't have to be too complex. You can just add one additional image, say habitat or host plant, to give a little bit more information, to tell a little bit more of a story about what you're talking about. And you know, iPhones can be great for that. The series really adds a lot of educational value, and the series could be something like simple, like we talked about before. It could be crypsis. It could be, you know, comparing mimicry, behavior, like we heard about earlier from Megan. So many things that you can get creative about to tell a cool story through a series. And it's a great way to keep an audience engaged, and always fun to have a reveal if you can. So just a couple of examples that I can share here. So first off is you know, here's a situation where it's a cryptic insect on a tree bark, and I'll just start this off by saying that you know, there's a well camouflaged insect just to the left of center. See if you can find it, and then kind of go on through these other slides. We get a little bit closer, again left of center, and then the next shot where it's dead center, and then just follow it up with here, you know, the insect, in this case Brachymena, this really amazing pentatomid. So real easy. The audience is automatically engaged because you're asking them to look and find something. So you're you know, actively engaging them. And then the next example, and this is an example where once you bring things inside, you can get super creative on how to do this. So in this case, it's a bunch of monarch frass with a beetle. And so you ask, you know, can you pinpoint which of these is the beetle? And then so you pop it to the next slide, and you just show that one of those monarch frass just sprung legs. And then the question is, how do they do that? And then you can show them you know, these fine grooves that they're able to bring their appendages into, and really form this amazing mimicry of caterpillar frass. And from there, you can take it to species diversity, the larvae that that are case bearing. So many different directions that you can take that. And that last thing is I always finish these series and think, oh, I wish I would have gotten a shot of that. And of course, the best shot that I missed here is from a distance, just to show that beetle on a leaf, just, you know, from like a bird's eye position. Okay, and then just one more shot here that demonstrates combining the two, the white background plus the images that tell a story. It's just a potter wasp that knocked the mud case off of a cover of a barbecue pit. So I thought I'd take a closer look here. So just as you go across the top, you can pop or open it up and see on the right-hand side, we've got a mature pupa, and on the left-hand side, there was still quite a lot of caterpillar prey left, and the larva that was completely covered in parasitic wasp larvae. And so that's what you can see down in the bottom left, and then there in the middle bottom where they've pupated, and then the Melitobia parasitic wasps that emerged from them. So many awesome jumping off points to tell stories from a series of shots like this. And with that, that's all I have.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks to all the presenters. We're going to spend the next bit fielding some of your questions and talking about them. If I can ask all the presenters to turn your video back on, and Isa will be coordinating the questions and putting them out to us. And I guess we'll just have a free-for-all from there.
Yeah, so one of the questions that came up a bunch of times was, will the recording be available after this presentation? And the answer is yes. If you check in the answered questions box, you will see that Joe has posted the link there, and I'll post it also into the chat here right now. So it's very accessible for you guys to see. We had a bunch of questions about what cameras we're using. You guys, if you want to go through that.
I'll do mine really fast because mine's probably the least sophisticated. So I saw in the chat a question about what is like a cheap camera option. And when I started doing macro photography about 7-8 years ago, I bought a Canon Rebel, which is kind of a low tier Canon SLR camera, which are pretty reasonably priced. Highly recommend for just getting started because you can change out the lenses and do macro lenses. It's reasonably priced, and if you're working at a university setting, there's probably a bunch of students that have bought them and that are selling them on Craigslist. So that would be my first suggestion. And then this is, oh, there we go. This is my current camera. It's a 5D Mark III Canon. That's what I use.
Okay, I also use Canon, and the camera I use probably the most right now is a 5D Mark IV.
And interesting enough, so it matters so little sometimes these days because so many of the decent cameras are really just that. They're completely sufficient. I had to go check because it matters that little. So I use a 90D. I've really invested a lot in cameras in the past. 90Ds are fairly cheap, so there's so many good options.
Yeah, if you're interested in macro photography, it'd be better to find out what macro lenses are out there available for that camera base, because you may want to pick out a system just because it has certain macro lenses. Don't pick out a body, then find out that that company does not make macro lenses.
Yeah, I too use a Canon, as I've mentioned, primarily Canon 90D like Chris, but I also have a 5D Mark IV. And my primary setup is actually a reverse Canon pancake lens. I most often use this little tiny 40mm lens. They also make a 24mm, which is so tiny. It's super lightweight. And I just reverse this backwards with an electronic adapter that allows me to retain communication between the camera and the lens. And then I use either my onboard flash for the 90D, which sounds really counterintuitive because onboard flashes are typically atrocious for most situations. But with the proper diffusion, you can do some really cool stuff. And then for my 5D, I have this little tiny Canon Speedlight flash, which is small, and with the appropriate sort of light direction and diffusion, you can get some really good shots with this without having to have a really expensive or heavy, cumbersome setup.
Alex, do you want to comment next?
Sure. I'm just going to reiterate that the lenses and the lighting is much more important than the camera back itself. And so your best advice is to spend your money on the lens. Well, look to see what photos you like by other photographers, figure out what lens they're using, try to get that lens, and then just get whatever camera back you can afford. No one's made a bad camera for years. They're all good. So just you can get one used and save yourself a bunch of money.
Yeah, I see there's a comment here by Judy in the chat saying, do any of you use mirrorless? And that's definitely something I've been interested in because of how much lighter and smaller they are. So right now I have been looking into like converters or so that I can maybe use some of my Canon lenses on a Sony mirrorless camera or something like that once I save up for that. But I don't right now. Maybe some of the others here have tried it, but
We
yeah.
all will be using mirrorless because these camera lines are eliminating their sort of prism-based systems. So we'll all be using mirrorless before we know it. And I think the basic principles apply. It's photography is photography, and we'll adapt. And the electronic viewfinders are getting better and better, so that the loss of the prism to me is less of a deal than it used to be. The trouble I have with the mirrorless ones is that they're so light that, I mean, I have big hands. I like feeling the heft of a camera system, and it's balanced. So I've got these heavy lenses, and when you get a mirrorless camera on those, the thing feels like it's going to topple over. So maybe someone could just sell ballast weights for mirrorless cameras to make them heavier, and I would like them more.
Yeah. Also, Jessica in the Q&A asked about flash or diffusion on phones. And so one thing that I did recommend is that there's definitely off-camera, like constant light options. Like if you look up selfie lights, you could try to test out that and then if you saw a lot of Tom's images were showing photographers with completely homemade diffusion sets. And if you haven't tried diffusion yet, definitely try it out. It'll change your world when it comes to photographing insects and bringing out the detail.
Yeah. So I just want to point out the trouble with using the on-camera light on a cell phone is that it is right next to the lens. So the light is blasting out from the actual lens, which means all the photos are going to give you that red eye, deer in the headlights, kind of flat, and it looks really unnatural. And so any kind of photography, you're going to want to look at options that allow you to increase the light from a more natural direction, usually overhead. Cell phones are great with low amounts of light. I mean, they trade off noise for that, but if you can get like one of those LED arrays for videography, like one of those 100 LED lights, and hold that overhead as sort of an artificial light brightener, that'll go a long way to making good cell phone photos where you need to augment the light.
A question by Ted in the Q&A was, what f-stop seems best for putting the subject in focus and the background out of focus? Would someone like to answer that?
That's going to depend a lot on the situation. Sometimes if you've got an insect that's parallel to the film plane or the sensor, you can use a shallower depth of field and try to blur the background more. And so it really depends. Each situation is different when you're working out there. And if you're trying to shoot by ambient light, you may have to open up too. So it's going to differ with each shot.
I will say it's really different for each lens. Like for the Canon 100mm macro, I like to be between 16 and 22. And it's good for each lens to have a familiar starting point. And the great thing about digital photography is you can see the results as it's happening. And so I always, to get things going quickly before the bug flies away, I like to have a setting I know works well enough, and then I'll take a look and adjust from there. But yeah, there's no like universal, this is best. It's just, I have a comfort zone with each lens as a starting point, and then I deviate based on the results.
Yeah, if some lenses, you start stopping them down too much, and they're going to become unsharp.
Yeah.
We also have a question about how do you capture fast moving insects, like a patrolling bee?
Move faster than the bee.
You really miss a lot of shots.
Yeah, a lot. Yeah, take a lot of shots. A lot of times with digital, you're going to have to sometimes, what they call spray and pray. You have to kind of shoot a lot of shots trying to get that one in focus, and that happens.
Yeah, and I would say that besides taking a lot of shots, like don't be too precious about it, because you can throw stuff away because it's digital photography. So take as many shots as you feel comfortable taking, sort through them later. And there's no shame in returning to a site the next day if you didn't get exactly what you wanted and trying again. I definitely do that.
Yeah, I was talking about it remaining stable, but sometimes you have to bob and weave with the insect and you're coming back and forth and trying to get that insect in focus, and you're shooting. You're shooting all the time, and it's sometimes it's hard to do.
I want to put a reminder here to please put your questions in the Q&A. That way people can upvote the other questions that they also want to ask, so we can help organize which questions we're asking next. Did you want to add something to the last one, Alex?
Yeah, so usually when I have a photo, sort of an action shot of an insect in flight, it's because the insect is predictable in a way that allows me to set up the camera ahead of time. I don't just like nab random bees as they go by. Like male carpenter bees patrol territory, and they're quite predictable, and they will hover. And that is long. I don't usually use autofocus, but I do for those because the bee will hover for just long enough for me to get a fix on it and get a picture. That's kind of an unusual situation. Otherwise, I'm hanging around a bee nest or a beehive, and I'll just sit there spraying and praying as bees come and go out of the entrance. You can get complicated with various infrared sensors and lasers to automatically trip the system. And what you're usually doing with those is something with flash, like those super high speed shots where everything's crisp. That's usually in an environment that's totally dark, where a flash is being triggered by an insect. This flash is much better than shutter for freezing the action. But you can do whole courses on like high-speed flash photography.
Yeah, it's knowing behavior, like we said before, knowing the behavior of the insect, trying to wait by a flower or wait by something that the insect's going to come into. And so again, knowing behavior, dragonflies will go ahead and hover or stop a certain area. So the more you know about the behavior of the insect or any animal you're shooting, the better shot you're going to get.
This is where entomologists have a real advantage over professional photographers, is how your animals behave and when you can catch them doing interesting things, and that'll give you way more interesting photos than a professional who can come in and take a super crisp shot of a bug not doing anything that's maybe identified to the wrong order or something. Who knows?
All right, so our next question, we didn't touch upon this in our presentation. So Jess is asking, do you edit your photos? If so, what is your preferred software? I guess I'll start by saying I try to make it so that when I take my photo, it needs minimal editing. That's the most ideal situation. So you want to get your lighting right. And the great thing is with digital photography, you can take as many pictures as you want and make adjustments. Of course, you don't know how cooperative your subject might be. So that's where the practice comes in. But I do use Lightroom. That's what I use right now.
Yeah, for me, I use primarily Photoshop. I do shoot RAW. I did see a few questions about whether people shoot RAW or JPEG. I do shoot exclusively RAW. JPEG's nice because then you can just kind of have an image to post if you want to post something right away, whereas RAWs might need to be processed a little bit before you're able to share those out, like on social media. But yeah, I use Photoshop, typically just some, lightening of shadows, maybe some sharpening if needed, or some cropping if needed there too, and then export as a JPEG, share out to social media.
Photoshop, 100% Photoshop. And yeah, I also photograph in RAW. And like I said, I take a lot of photos, so I trash the crap and I put the good stuff on external hard drive so it doesn't weigh down my computer.
Yeah, I use Lightroom mostly and only do Photoshop for when I have to like get rid of dust specks or things that are really like manipulating part of the image. Lightroom does most things. And the great thing about Lightroom is that it's non-destructive. So Lightroom just filters your original image without touching the file to display in a particular way, which means that 10 years later, when you come back to it and you think, oh God, what was I thinking? This image is all green or something. You can go back and to the original and redo it in a better way. So say Lightroom is typically what I use.
Yeah, I always make a copy of the image when I'm working with it and then use it in Photoshop. When I'm shooting, I'm saving a small JPEG and then a RAW. And that way, if somebody needs something out right away, I can send out small JPEGs.
Yeah, just to finish the round. So I use Photoshop and minimal processing, Danae had said, some highlights, sharpening, that sort of thing.
We have some questions coming up about photo stacking. If someone wants to comment on that. I don't do too much myself, but it's something I've been meaning to get more into. And I know that some cameras are starting to do photo stacking within the camera, which is pretty exciting technology.
Okay, so photo stacking, what this means is you're taking a series of images of the same subject that were photographed at different focal planes, so that in one, the eye's in focus, but the butt's out of focus. You know, in another one, the thorax is in focus, but the eye and butt. So you combine them all into a single fully focused image, and they look super sharp and sometimes a little bit surreal because, you know, it's an optically impossible image. But you see a lot of it in bug photography because insects are small. We're always challenged by depth of field, and one way to get that depth of field is essentially to cheat with computers by making a composite. And so there's lots of programs that do it. It's a very involved subject, and it's fairly controversial as to whether or not it's a good thing with live subjects. In natural history museums, it's routine because it takes great archival images of specimens you can use for taxonomic research. I think it's more controversial when you get into nature photography and your, sharpenings. I do it sometimes in a limited capacity, but it's kind of tricky and time consuming. So very particular things I'll do with it.
Yeah, I've never used it on live insects. I have shot, specimens for that when I'm shooting pictures for books where you need definition and stack a couple photos for that on a dead specimen, but I haven't used it in live.
I feel like it's most effective when it's very limited, like it's maybe 2 or 3 images and the depth of field is still pretty narrow, but it's just that part that is in focus is just that much crisper. Like Thomas Shahan does a great job of this, just very subtly stacking a couple images so you wouldn't necessarily know. Where the stacking is really weird is when you stack like 150 images that includes the very front to the very back, and the whole thing becomes very flat and weird looking because you suddenly obliterated the depth that our brains need to make sense of it. So I don't know, play around with it and see how you go. If you have very active subjects like ants, for instance, it's really hard to do focus stacking on live specimens because everything needs to be pretty motionless for it to work.
Yeah, and really fast, I just wanted to put in a plug that, when you're a photographer, you're gonna decide what is the ultimate use for your photos. Are you producing artsy photos for a calendar? Are you producing scientific reference images for identification? Are you photographing your laboratory setup or your research station? There are different types of photography that require different types of equipment and different types of final output, and not all of them are appropriate. So we're here on the calendar committee, and we're here to talk about like a lot of really beautiful, like well-framed, well-composed, like great lighting type of shots. But sometimes that isn't even what you want. You maybe just want something that really just the business and just the technical information. And then something like a laboratory setup that can do that focus stacking really is the best tool for that.
All right. Yeah, make sure you guys put your questions in the Q&A, and we have about 8 more minutes here today. We have some questions that are like, what are your typical settings when you take a photograph of an insect, which I guess can vary based on the conditions, and what ISO you're comfortable with using.
I mean, I can share here only because I use a very narrow range of settings with the reverse lens setup. I rarely change settings at all once I go out into the field, particularly when I'm using my Canon 90D with the onboard flash. My max synchronization speed, so the max fastest shutter speed I can use when that flash is popped is 1/250th of a second. So I don't change that. It's always set for 1/250th of a second. I tend to shoot at f11 for aperture. And then the only setting that I might change if needed would be the ISO. White balance, I've found that shooting for like cloudy or shady conditions tends to give me the best color. And yeah, so the ISO would be the only thing that I actually change out in the field, which is really nice because I don't have to do a lot of like brain thinking when I'm out in the field trying to, photograph subjects. But that's a very narrow range, right? Just with like works well with the reverse lens, but it's not going to work as well possibly with other setups.
Click on a photo online and look at the EXIF data. That will tell you what the photographer is using. It's a very good trick. And you can see my settings there. They're kind of all over the place. But I used to never really go above ISO 400 or 800. But technology has advanced so much that in certain situations, I'll crank it up to 3200. And honestly, I've never had a photo editor kick a photo back and say, hey, do you have this, but slightly less grainy? No one really cares. If the subject's good, it's in focus. You can get away with a pretty broad range of ISO, especially coming from the newer sensors that are pretty clean.
Yeah, we said if you're trying to bring in ambient light too, that makes a difference. Try to adjust to the light that's out there, trying to bring in backgrounds, etc. So you have to shoot, open it up, use a higher ISO, a little bit slower shutter speed, or open up your f-stops.
Yeah, and Alex, you might be able to confirm whether this is true or Tom, but I've always read that the closer you are physically to your subject, the narrower your plane of depth of field. So if you're shooting at something like f11, but you're 2 inches away from your subject with something like a reverse lens or Canon MP or some of the newer like Venus Laowa lenses, versus shooting at f11, but you're like 12 to 18 inches away from your subject, that plane of focus is going to be different in those given situations. So your aperture in particular and how you approach sort of the depth of field decision making in the field is going to look very different depending on how physically close to your subject you happen to be.
I'm photographing a big bug far away. I'm opening that aperture up to try to blur the background, because the trouble there is the natural depth of field is too deep. And so I really want to make it narrow. Whereas when I'm in super close, I'm stopping down, because as you get in closer and closer, the focal plane really quite rapidly narrows. So yeah, everything's very condition dependent. There's no like, here are the great settings that work all the time.
Right, and it also changes the distance of your background too. So when you're farther away, your subject can focus and your background's in focus. You move real close, then your subject becomes in focus, your background starts going blurry.
We have some questions on what materials we're using for diffusion. Specifically, some of the questions of what they're seeing, what Tom was using in the photos. Then also there's a question also specifically asking about what Alex was using with his twin flashes.
I can send it out. I used to just use tracing paper because I lived in Arizona where there was no humidity. But as soon as I took that gear into the rainforest, it just melted. So I use a diffuser. It's the Roscoe Lux Tough White diffusion. And it is made by a theater gel company that does, lighting for theater lights. And it's their plain white. And it costs like $6 for a big sheet. And that's like a year's supply for me. And you can get it through B&H and Adorama and these standard things. And it works both as a diffuser for my flashes and substrate. So when I'm doing white background stuff, the stuff's got a fine enough texture that you don't see it, but not so fine that you get that glossy reflective. So it kind of looks like a computer generated shadow, but all it is this Roscoe Lux diffusion on, just sitting there into the subject. Really versatile stuff.
Yeah, I've used, sometimes you have to experiment a lot trying to find your diffusion material, because some of it will give you a weird color balance. So you can also, I have, pieces of plastic, which I go ahead and cut and use around the lens. And then a lot of times I'll put a piece of packing foam almost over it. You can get a thin white packing foam that you get, all the times from Amazon or whoever for something wrapped around that, and check some of it and use it in test shots, especially with beetles, and see what kind of diffusion you get, because some of it's different than others. And you can attach that to the plastic, or you can also attach what Alex was saying to plastic too. That gives you a little bit more stability, and it doesn't flop around quite as much.
The general principle, you want your diffuser close to the subject and far from the flash. If you move your flash too close to the diffuser, it starts giving a spotlight until you're basically right on top of the diffuser and it's not diffusing it at all. So you want to bring that flash back so that that beam has a chance to spread out and cover your whole diffuser. And that'll give you a lot more pleasing diffusion.
Right. You can experiment with that sometimes too by putting a flash close and far away. And you may want to have it different distances with different insects. With beetles, particularly, you want that flash very far away from that diffuser. And if you're shooting more Lepidoptera, you may want a little bit closer to the diffuser. If you're trying to show detail on the scales, especially if you're trying to do side lighting. So experiment again. That's the most important thing. Go out there and shoot. Use your equipment and know what it's going to do, and experiment with different insects, maybe pinned insects. Try to experiment, see how the diffusion is going to work on different types of insects, and then you're ready to go into the field with it.
Yeah, I have a commercial diffuser that I use on my built-in flash. And then I'm using Stencil Blank, which is just plastic. I got this at the craft store. It is shiny. So Alex kind of mentioned like the softer material that you're using that absorbs light more than this would. But I've just kind of created this, and I literally just wrap it around my lens. It has a piece of Velcro on it. And then like Alex said, the flash is coming out of here, but then right before it hits the subject, it's being diffused a little bit further away from the flash point. And this is nice because it's waterproof. So I don't have to worry about it, getting destroyed in the field very easily.
Yeah, we could do an entire workshop on just building diffusion.
Oh yeah, when you're using a flash and trying to diffuse it, some of you pick up a flash, it has this function called zoom, and you're like, how does a flash zoom? You want to pay attention to that with diffuser, because what that function does is it projects a wider or narrower beam. And so you want the widest one possible if you're going for diffusion, unless you're shooting like a dragonfly that's 10 meters away and you want to try to get that light to go as far as possible, then you'd be. But yeah, often I'm having diffusing problems. That's because I've forgotten that the zoom is set really narrow on the flash and it's giving me a hot spot rather than a more diffuse pattern.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for your questions. We're hitting 3:30 now, so really sorry if we didn't get to answer yours, but thank you guys so much for being here and for asking.
Yeah, and remember to submit your favorite bug images to the NSOC calendar, because we would love to see them, and I think the entomological community would also love to see them.
And the deadline is coming up.
Yeah, when is the deadline?
I think it's
It's
next
early
month,
May. What was it? May 5th, was it, Joe?
sometime in May.
May 5th, that's right.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you guys once
Thanks,
again.
everybody.
I am sure everyone who was watching would love to give you a round of applause and want you to hear it, because that was excellent. And we look forward to seeing all the submissions for the calendar this year. But this was an excellent panel. Thank you for the webinar, and we'll get the recording posted soon.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone.